Hello lovely people, my name is Emma and today I'm bringing you my reading wrap up for the month of April. So I finished, I think it'll actually be 11 books technically. One of them was at the very end of March, but I missed it off of my March TBR or like wrap up. So I've got 11 books to talk about and then a DNF that I'm going to mention at the very end. The first book that I finished, like I said, technically still in the month of March, is The Plus One by Mazey Eddings. This is a contemporary romance. It's sort of a fake dating, mild inconvenience to lovers. Think brother's best friend also in there, kind of hitting a lot of the tropes. And it's basically about a woman who is having a very bad day. She finds out that her boyfriend's cheating. She moves in with her brother, but finds her brother's best friend, who's a doctor who works primarily in war zones, also home, and tries to hide the fact that she doesn't have anywhere to live from him. And then they end up in a very convoluted fake dating thing for the brother's like wedding weekend. It kind of didn't really work for me. I wasn't that bothered about the chemistry between the two main characters, and it really felt like, I feel like there's a lot of contemporary romance out there at the moment that have this very like cutesy cover, and it turns out the stuff that they're dealing with is almost like the author wanted to do literary fiction but wasn't confident enough in their abilities, and so threw in a bit of contemporary romance tropes anyway. So in this one, our main character works in mental health, and our sort of hero is basically having a complete breakdown from everything that he's seen out in the wars, and can't cope with it emotionally. And it's a lot more about kind of the exploration of like the role of therapy and also like burnout, especially within doctors and like people who work in high trauma environments. And that really took center stage in a way that then made the like cutesy contemporary romance moments feel really weird, and didn't really jive with me. And the fake dating felt incredibly like contrived and barely even really featured. It felt like it was there more so that way a book talk person could be like, fake dating, enemies to lovers, brothers best friends, kind of like trope energy in a video, rather than actually like tying it to the story. So for me it didn't particularly work, but you know, win some, lose some. The next book I finished was a non-fiction, and that is The Darkness Echoing by Gillian. And I really feel like today's wrap up is going to be a lot of like, I enjoyed it but kind of energy. And for this one, I enjoyed it, but I do think that there are much better non-fiction books out there. This is a look at Ireland's places of famine, death and rebellion, and sort of a look at the idea of Ireland as sort of a country with a fair amount of catastrophe in its history, a fair lot of rack and ruin, but also a sort of cultural identity that latches onto their sort of history of carnage and depression and famine and all sorts of problems that have happened in their past. The structure of this book was really what I struggled with. Each chapter was focused on a different aspect, whether it be like the famines or rebellions or wars or things like that. Whereas I actually feel like a chronological history would have carried it through much stronger, because so much of the things that happened in one chapter would be referenced in another chapter, and the chapters weren't in chronological order in the sense of like, we didn't sort of start off with rebellions and then end with like things like it bounced around so much that I really found it very difficult to keep the timeline in place and to keep all the names in place. And this was really compounded by the fact that we got a lot of little asides of Gillian O'Brien's like journeys. Basically she went on like a road trip around Ireland to go to all these various places, so we got to see like things about like, you know, her nephew and nieces like cartwheeling across the fields where so many people had died kind of energy. But actually I found it easier to remember their names than I did to remember the names of the people from history that I genuinely cared about. So that was really frustrating. Gillian O'Brien also seemed to take great offence to every museum that she walked into. She seemed really angry about how history is currently being handled both either in Ireland or museums as a whole. This idea of like pandering to the audiences, really limited in the information that they give, and sort of not necessarily covering the periods of history that she was interested in, which I think was really unfair, because, you know, museums are sort of public spaces that still have to like attract visitors, justify their existence, justify their like salary costs and their running costs, and like if you have to do the big flashy like specific, like, you know, the IRA exhibit, when actually something that's a little bit more niche would have been like more interesting for Gillian, sometimes you have to do the heavy hitters just to like get people through the door. So I don't think it was particularly fair of her to be like constantly critiquing these museums, and I don't really know what she wanted from it at the end of it. In terms of like, I'm still pleased I read it because I knew so little about Irish history, and I do know more now, but I feel like I would have known even more if this had been structured in a different way, possibly just had a different author tackle it. But I am going to go off and find some other books on Ireland about areas that particularly caught my interest from this, which was kind of what this book was supposed to do. So like a 3.5 star read, I guess. Then I read Circus of Wonders by Elizabeth Macneal. This was on my 5-star fictions prediction list. I think I gave it 4 stars, which might even be a 3.5. Like I say, a lot of I liked it but kind of energy from today. This is the tale. It's set in 1866, and it is about a circus coming to town, and there is a woman there who has got a hideous disfigurement according to the book. It's kind of like a vitiligo, like mole type situation, and they're calling her the leopard woman. And she gets sold off to the circus, but in doing so it's about her time there, becoming a star, and the tense relationship she has with 2 brothers, one who runs and owns the circus and one who has some kind of weird deep dark thing in his past connected to some kind of war, and that sort of seems to overshadow a lot of the book. Elizabeth Macneal has an incredibly rich, very pretty writing style, so whilst I was in the book I had a good time and it was really good fun, sort of the lyrical, very atmospheric writing that she did, especially with the very much like circus is so heavily a visual sort of art form, and so I really enjoyed that. I thought a lot of the stuff that she was writing about sort of how circuses worked in that time was relatively accurate. There were references to genuine circuses like Astley and Barnum and people like that, so I really enjoyed those kind of conversations. The actual plot though felt very flat, and it was kind of like A Water for Elephants but just with a slight like little bit of a remix, and the big sort of secret other storyline going on behind the scenes was not actually that shocking, and everyone felt quite two-dimensional. So I liked the setting and I liked the sort of lush world, but the characters and the plot were definitely a bit of a letdown. But if you enjoy historical fiction, I think you'll still enjoy this one. It is sort of fun setting for the time period, and like I say, very pretty writing. Then I finished Jailbird by Vonegurt. This is sort of a classic, a modern classic book, and this is about a gentleman who is embroiled in the Watergate scandal, and it's about his time in prison. And it's sort of an epic look at his life, and is a sort of a very big commentary on capitalism and sort of the kind of grind culture that America was going through at the time, and a kind of a look at things like the Wall Street crash and other stuff sort of around there, and kind of the knock-on ramifications of this. I had a really good time, but I am now struggling to piece together this one compared to the Orwell that I also read in quite quick succession, which again was like a man's life. I did really like Kurt Vonnegut's turn of phrase. I thought he had some very powerful writing styles, and I listened to it in audiobook, really enjoyed that format, really enjoyed the narrator, and it was sort of like fun little glimpses into like American history as we went through. So it's intrigued me enough to definitely check out more of Kurt Vonnegut in the future. I think this is his least sci-fi, or one of his least sci-fi. I know he does stuff that's a lot more like weird and genre bending-y and has time travel and weird shit like that, whereas this was very much like a straight flat contemporary literary kind of the time, but yeah, really interesting snapshot into kind of the zeitgeist of America at the time. And I liked our main character. I liked hanging out in his head. I thought he was sort of a quite entertaining guy. Then I read George Orwell's Coming Up for Air. This is about a gentleman who kind of hates his life. He's sort of got your classic suburban American experience, and it is about him he's gone through the First World War. It's his experiences within the First World War, and the Second World War is rumbling on on the horizon. It's in 1939. Now that I've said is he American or is he in the UK? I really should know that. I have read this book, I promise. Anyway, wherever it's set, God, I'm sorry, like I say, the Kurt Vonnegut and him just sort of slightly blurring, but it's about him sort of trying to recapture his youth, essentially, and looking at his life and seeing sort of where mistakes have been made and decisions and turning points in the road, and really trying to capture that zeitgeist of his childhood and that lost innocence since the war, and sort of his hatred of where the world is going at that point, and how he feels like he can see it coming but nobody else is listening to him. He's a really likable character. I was so sympathetic to him in so many ways, and I just sort of could kind of, it's amazing how many similarities there are each generation as you go along, sort of that looking back on your childhood and reminiscing about, like, you know, progress and the way that technology has changed and the way that pricing has changed and the way that like everything you felt like you were promised as a kid never actually materialized, and you thought your life was going to pan out one way and it comes out a completely different way. And I really feel like that's something that so many people can kind of latch onto, and I can imagine that this is kind of book that reading it in your like 20s compared to reading it in your 30s, your 40s, your 50s, your 60s, you're going to be coming to it in so many different ways. George Orwell, I think, is just stunning author. Love his writing style, and this is no exception. Always beautiful, always really interesting sort of sentence structures, really having fun and playing with words, and I feel like this one is definitely no different. So absolutely enjoyable read. Then I finished An Immense World by Ed Yong, How Animal Senses Reveal the Hidden Realms Around Us. And this is a non-fiction biology book, pop science, looking at the various different ways that animals and living things on our planet can interact with the world and experience that world through like our interface. He calls it the Umwelt, I believe is how we're pronouncing that. And it's sort of the experience, the qualia, the actual like sensation of existing in our world, and how difficult it can be to know what it's like to know what somebody else is experiencing, especially when our senses vary so differently across various different living things. So each chapter jumps on sort of a different type of sense. It is very similar to Sentient that I talked about a couple of months back, but this one I feel like goes into more detail. It's a very chunky book and we're branching off into more areas, and it doesn't really look at humans at all, whereas Sentient was using like an example of an animal that is particularly good in one area and then jumping off to look at human senses. This one is very much just sitting in the realm of animal senses and rolling through a bunch of different variations on how animals experience the world. Now, if you're a pop science fanatic like me, you are going to love this book. It is a solid slam dunk, so popular, so hyped over the past couple of years for a good reason. Ed Yong really is just like becoming a firm favourite new author for me in the science world. This is chunkier than his other ones, I Contain Multitudes. It's probably a solid at least like 70 to 100 pages longer, and I think you can really see that because definitely in the middle you do start to get bogged down with some details. So if you're not used to reading a lot of pop science, you may struggle to wade through this one, but if you're happy to kind of let some of it wash over you, then really intensely enjoyable. I think I listened to this one in audiobook, enjoyed that immensely, and yeah, there's lots of different really cool fun facts, loads of different areas to branch off into, and some of it does repeat some of the other stuff that is out there at the moment in pop science. I feel like, you know, birds being in a sense magnetic fields has become a real like buzz topic, or it just so happens it keeps appearing in books I'm reading, who knows. But I do find that in this kind of area of non-fiction, repetition is not a problem because that's how we actually like learn and retain information. So really great. Fantastic book. Then I read You Made a Fool of Death with Your Beauty by Akwaeke Emezi. They are a really fun author who does a lot of different stuff in a lot of different genres, and I read their book Freshwater a while ago and deeply enjoyed it. This is their stab at a contemporary romance, and I did not really think it worked. This was about a woman who experienced a lot of grief. Her husband or fiance, I can't remember, died horribly in a car accident where she walked away pretty much unscathed, and then it's about her falling into a relationship with a guy who he definitely wants more than she's willing to give. She's kind of very much sort of on the friend zone kind of energy. They go away to stay with his dad, who's this big hotshot celebrity chef, and she immediately and instantly, very intensely falls in love with the dad, and shenanigans ensue. Now, this kind of should have been up my alley, but honestly, I didn't really buy the relationship. It felt incredibly insta-love, and it felt incredibly very like soap opera reality TV show by the end of it, and you're like, yeah, Emma, she falls in love with his dad, but like more than I would expect from these kinds of books. I've read this kind of a storyline in other contemporary romances that I bought a lot more. We also at the beginning messed around with a completely different guy for a while, and it just meant that I found it like there wasn't much room for the main relationship by the end of things. Also, the sex scenes, massive letdown. They like kind of hinted at stuff for ages, and then by the time we actually got to the sex scene, it really wasn't that hot anymore. Like all the kind of tension had fizzled out for me, so it didn't particularly work for me. I do think Akwaeke Emezi has a stronger grip of like the craft of writing than you would expect from a contemporary romance book, and maybe I'm just being a massive snob about genres here, and it just felt like it was overwritten and overworked in so many places compared to the style of writing I expect from a contemporary romance. So I also found that a little bit jarring, but that might have just been because of reading their other work and kind of knowing what they can do with words and sort of coming to that with that slightly more literary lens. So yeah, not my favourite. Then I had a bit of a spur of the moment purchase where I was in town, didn't have a book with me. I know, what was I thinking not having a book with me? I was waiting for the hubby to finish up work and basically had to go to the works and just buy something cheap to sit and read in Costa for an hour whilst waiting to give him a lift. But I'm really pleased I did, because I had a fantastic time with this book, and that is Godkiller by Hannah Kanner. This has been very much hyped at the moment. You know, every time I walk into a bookshop, it's on a table with all the big hype. I believe the sequel is either out or about to come out, and a lot of people have been chattering about this book. So I've kind of been avoiding it because of the hype, but honestly picked it up for a £5 in the works and was so happy I did. This is a really fun, I think high fantasy, but please don't at me if I'm wrong. I'm bad at fantasy subgenres. High fantasy world where gods exist and their power is derived from how much people believe in them, make sacrifices to them, whether it be like actual physical people or like little items and things like that, and have shrines and stuff. It has been several years since there was a war against the gods that had basically managed to banish them, and now god worship is completely banned. And our main character is a Godkiller who walks around murdering these new gods who pop up because people, it's believing in stuff, and they're gods of things like the gods of broken shoes, or the gods of a good harvest, or the gods of getting home safely. It's very much that kind of like folklore kind of energy to it. Our main character is absolutely fantastic. She loses her leg incredibly early on in her journey as a child in a very traumatic event that like shapes her as a person. I thought that was really excellent representation for someone being an amputee and like how to maneuver around with this world with a prosthetic. So fantastic disability rep there. And there are also several deaf characters. Sign language is used quite extensively in the book, which was really cool as well. She ends up going on a bit of a trip to the center of like the city where the gods used to mainly live. And along the way, she picks up a random child who has a god attached to her, and like in like a symbiotic relationship they can't seem to break, and this like ex-knight who's trying to hide his identity, who's doing something for the king. Shenanigans ensue, they're on the road, lots of fun stuff happens, there's a little bit of a budding romance going on. Freaking loved it. I was here for it. I loved the world building. I thought it was such a cool concept, executed really, really well. I loved the kind of dynamics. It is a multiple POV, and I enjoyed every person's head that we're in, and they felt really distinct and different to me, whereas a lot of POV books I find it's the same voice. This one really did feel like it was strong, each individual character. Super intrigued where this one's going, so definitely going to be buying the second book once it comes out in paperback. I'm really excited to continue with the plot because it definitely ends on a bit of an intense cliffhanger that I won't spoil for you. So yeah, really cool. If you like rich, very lyrical kind of world building, I think you'll enjoy this one. And it kind of gave me N.K. Jemisin vibes, so just something to think about. Oh, we have got a cook. Okay, we can get through these. Then I read Winterblaze by Kristen Callihan, which is the third book in the Darkest London series, and I've actually read them in order, kind of. So this is a historical paranormal fantasy romance. Yeah, historical paranormal romance. Not sure if it counts as fantasy. Basically, there are elemental witches, there are werewolves, there are things called gims. It's very strange. And book 3 is following. It's kind of a second chance love story between Poppy, who is the head of this big agency, and her husband, whose name I now can't remember. Winston, I think, who has found out that she's like head of this big agency and feels very betrayed, has been attacked by a werewolf, and it's sort of about them coming together and him forgiving her. Now, something happens about a third of the way through that quite dramatically changes what that plotline is, and I didn't really vibe with that. I felt like it leveled the playing field in a way that I wasn't particularly happy with. I wanted there to be more of a conversation about Poppy and sort of her like lies with Winston, rather than finding a way to also make him culpable. And the actual overarching plot I wasn't bothered by at all. So this one, it was fine, and I quite like the sex scenes at the beginning for that whole like I know you, and we've got all this longing and tension because we have all this history, but there's this big barrier between us. So I like second chance romances normally, but this one I felt like the plot overshadowed it and I wasn't bothered by it. And I don't think I'm going to continue the series. I've kind of had a little look at the summaries for some of the other books, and I think I might need to just walk away from this one. Then I read In Monteparnasses by Sue Rowe, with the emergence of surrealism in Paris from Duchamp to Dali. This was fun, but again, I think like worth a read, but could have been done better. It is a look at specific time period within France, in Paris, looking at surrealism. It's kind of just before and then after the First World War, where we're looking at things like Dadaism and Cubism, which then sort of became the birthplace for surrealism, and the various people who were involved in that. You get people like Duchamp and his ready-mades, and you get sort of the anger of Dadaism, which was very much a response to the First World War and the brutality of the First World War, and then it's sort of evolving with politics in mind to become what surrealism became, and then when Dali came onto the scene. I enjoyed it because I like art history and I like this time period and I like a lot of these artists already. It is the kind of book, like so many in art history, where you need your phone to hand to be googling the images of some of this artwork, because it definitely is helpful. Whilst there are some pictures in it, like here, there's no way you could possibly have all the paintings referenced and the sculptures and stuff in this book, so definitely have a phone to hand to look them up. But for me, it felt like a very superficial look at surrealism. There wasn't really much conversation about like why people were doing what they were doing and sort of what the response was from other art movements and sort of its place in a sort of grander concept of the art world. It felt very much like, and then Duchamp went to New York and did this. And then he came back to Paris and did this. And then there was a tea party with Dali and so and so. And this is when they met. And it just felt very like, and then A, then B, then C, then D, without it really feeling like there was much like interrogation of what happened. It also was incredibly critical of Dadaism in a way that I didn't think was particularly appropriate. Sort of seemed to very much like shun it as like the weaker, less interesting sort of like embryo that surrealism then grew from, if that makes sense. And I feel like if you don't have a background in art history already, you could be completely lost in this book because there wasn't much of a point of an explanation. And I know that this author's previous book is the time period before, so this felt like almost a sequel where I hadn't read book one, but it was assumed that I knew book one. So that's just something to bear in mind if you're not strong on art history. We're nearly there. Then I read The Proposal, which is Animorph's book number 35, which is by A Applegate. This is a middle grade series from the 90s, which is about a group of 5 children who gain the ability to morph into animals once they've acquired their DNA from a dying alien, because it turns out Earth is actually the epic battlefield between the Yeerks, who are the bad guys, and the Andalites, who are the good guys, and they've got to try and stop the Yeerk invasion until the Andalites can arrive. Did you get that? Are you on board? Are you picked up with the world building? Now, I read book 35 because that's how far along I am, so I'm not going to tell you the details of book 35. A bunch has happened. But basically, it was fine, but there's a period of time in this series where ghostwriters got heavily involved, and I'm still in the middle of the ghostwriting bit, so nothing's really quite right. It feels very uncanny valley. None of the characters are quite acting like they should be, and everything feels a little bit like Monster of the Week throwaway stuff rather than actually advancing the plot in ways that I'm interested in. So because of that, I am continuing with the series. I'm going to finish these books in the next couple of years. I kind of chip away and do like 5 or 6 each year. It has been a bit of a mammoth task, I'm not gonna lie. And I think a lot of my enthusiasm has dropped because of the fact that we're in the ghostwriting bit. But normally they're really cool, really powerful, great characters, and really interesting conversations about like the damage that this war would do to these kids, and like the body horror of actually like having to kill things and being injured yourself, and like the constantly changing. And it's quite fun to get into the heads of the animals that they morph into. But we just need to wade through this ghostwriting bit and then it'll be fine. So those are the however many books I actually read and finished for this month, but I did want to mention a DNF just because it was on a yearly TBR, and otherwise you guys will be like, well, what happened to that book? And that is James Baldwin's Another Country. And I can't believe I've actually DNF'd this one. But I'm also so sad that I wasn't enjoying it. I love James Baldwin's Giovanni's Room, which is why he was on my Classics TBR for this year. I was really hoping to find another slam dunk book, but this one just didn't work for me. So I have walked away from it partway through because I found myself skim reading in a way that like, you're gonna skim read for a couple of hours to blitz it and finish it, and then it's like you haven't even read it anyway. So what's the point in doing this? So this tells the story of Rufus, who is a black guy who ends up in a relationship with a white lady whose name I can't remember. It's very abusive. And then he ends up committing suicide, and I'm going to tell you that because it happens early on enough in the book that I don't feel like it counts as a spoiler. And then it like jumps to a different set of characters, and then it jumps to a different set of characters again. And it was at the third jump even that I was like, I don't care about these people. I haven't had any time to build a relationship with these people. I care about the other people, and we just seem to be like bouncing from person to person. I didn't really like Rufus. I felt like there was whole conversations about what it means to be a black man, which is definitely what James Baldwin's whole thing is. But I saw an interesting quote from somebody, and I can't remember who, which basically said James Baldwin prioritizes the male suffering over, like, he uses male suffering to like justify inflicting women suffering on his women characters. And I really felt like that was apparent in this book. Like, Rufus is a terrible person who beats his wife or girlfriend, I can't remember if they get married, but his like pain and suffering from being a black man in America is used to justify him beating her, and I didn't really like that. And you know, possibly there are people who have read and like analysed this book will say it's not used to justify whatever, but like that was kind of the sort of surface level reading I got from it. And and I wasn't sympathetic for him. I didn't really care about him. He was a very unlikable character, and then he dies, and then we move on to a different set of unlikable characters that I also didn't really care about, and it just kept being a cycle of people who I didn't really care about. So because of that, I DNF'd it at page 200. I do intend to read more James Baldwin in the future. Whether I get to it in this year, I'm not sure. I will be considering this like taking it off of my classics TBR as completed in some way, shape or form. So if you have a different recommendation for James Baldwin, I'd be really pleased. I would like to hear it from you, because like I say, really bummed out Another Country didn't work for me. So there you have it. Those are the books that I finished in the month of April. A pretty good reading month, a little couple of hit misses in there, a lot of 3.5 reads. So hopefully May goes a bit better. Do let me know in the comments down below, have you read any of these books? What did you think? Did you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? All of the various things. Have a wonderful reading week, and I'll chat to you soon. Bye.